It is a truth universally acknowledged that Jane Austen is not for the boys.
Men are socialized, in the United States at least, to look askance at books written by women.
I dropped my mom off at a Jane Austen festival once. There were about 200 people there, and literally the only man I saw was a character actor playing Mr. Darcy.
It's the same, like, boys read violent books and girls read romances. But you have to sort of break through the stereotype.
I'm a dude! I like books about overcoming the struggles of poverty and war! Not rich white girl problems. Ugh!
Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. I'm Claudia and I love Jane Austen. Absolutely shocking, I know. As a 33-year-old woman who runs a YouTube channel about classic literature, it's so unexpected. Though actually, if you've paid really close attention, there might have been a clue or two over the years. What can I possibly say to defend myself? Jane Austen is absolutely everywhere these days. She's on Netflix, she's in the gift shop of every British museum, she's even on the money. She's on this channel a lot, and my videos about her aren't usually controversial. Except for the ones about Mansfield Park. Mansfield Park fans truly are a different breed. This video, well, I have an inkling that this might attract the John Thorpes of the internet. Do me a favor and don't be a John Thorpe in this comment section. This video is about Jane Austen, and it's about men. I'm sure we can all be civilized about that. Modern Janeites are described by their most fervent detractors in the same tones as Trekkies. Academically speaking, the Janeite phenomenon can be seen as the first subculture, with all the attendant aspects, including pejorative but also positive. I'm not trying to be a snob about Wikipedia. We all know it's a useful resource, and in this age of AI, it's more reliable than we give it credit for. But you can't just write something like, the Janeite phenomenon can be seen as the very first subculture, without backing that up with at least something of substance. I'm also curious to know who the Janeites' most fervent detractors are. Is there a Jane Austen haters club out there? If so, I can hazard a guess at the founder and president. Either way, it's undeniable that there is a modern Jane Austen. Subculture really isn't the right word there, Wikipedia. It's not a subculture, it's a fandom. That's what it is. There's a modern Jane Austen fandom that has existed for a long time and is seemingly only growing in the 21st century. There's magazines and websites and social media accounts dedicated to Jane Austen and her work. The city of Bath is very cleverly capitalizing on its own connection with Austen's life and writing, and runs events inspired by her that draw tourists from all over the world. She's been on the British £10 note for 7 years and counting. She's a cultural icon and her popularity is undeniable. In particular, during the first year of the COVID pandemic, the online Jane Austen fandom really took off. Reading Jane Austen became something of an escape for many who might not have otherwise given her books much attention. But even before then, the Jane Austen fandom was alive and thriving. The Jane Austen Society of North America, the largest Austen fan club in the world, has over 5,000 members. The tagline on their official website reads, 6 novels, 200 plus years, millions of fans. That's right, fans, not members of a subculture. Either way, there's another word to describe a devoted admirer of Jane Austen and her work. You know what it is, because I've said it a few times already in this video. Janeite. Close your eyes for a moment. I promise you're not missing anything on the screen. Got your eyes closed? Good. Now, picture a Janeite. Switch on your inner David Attenborough. There's the Janeite in its natural habitat, probably reading Persuasion, judging by its expression of absolute enrapture. Under no circumstance must it be approached during the letter scene. You're still picturing a Janeite, right? What are you seeing with your mind's eye? How dare. It was a woman though, right? You were picturing a woman. All the Jane Austen fans are women, everyone knows that. Otherwise, what's the point of me even making this video? The term Janeite was first coined by George Sainsbury in his 1894 introduction to Pride and Prejudice. He talks about how Jane Austen fans love all of her work truly, rather than by convention, and how every one of her books is someone's favourite, and for good reason. And in the sect, fairly large and yet unusually choice of Austenians or Janeites, there would probably be found partisans of the claim to primacy of almost every one of the novels. Of course, Saintsbury counts himself as among the sect, which is no surprise considering he was a big old nerd who wrote an introduction to Pride and Prejudice. The term Austenians never quite caught on, which is a shame because it sounds like a super cool secret society I think we can all agree we'd like to be members of. Password. It is a truth universally acknowledged that...
Sorry, could you repeat that?
It is a truth universally acknowledged that... Come on, every bloody week. A single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a...
Social media network?
So Austenians didn't catch on as a term, but the other word Saintsbury used to describe Austen's admirers, Janeites, certainly did. Though someone at some point added an extra E, which just makes sense, linguists don't come at me. Actually, I only know one linguist in person and I reckon I could take him in a fight. In 1924, Rudyard Kipling of Jungle Book fame further popularized the term Janeite by publishing a short story with the title The Janeites. The Janeites is an interesting story, a bit of a challenging read because it's Rudyard Kipling and I don't particularly care for his writing style. But if you're interested in the culture of the Jane Austen readership, it's well worth it. We'll get back to Kipling later in this video, but first let's turn our attention to the modern world of the Janeites, which doesn't feel so much like a secret society, but rather an enormous fan club. And all you have to do to access that is have a little browse on YouTube or TikTok or your favorite podcasting app. Jane Austen content is everywhere, this channel very much included. I've had a little look at my own videos, and over the years I've made around 40 videos about Jane Austen. They range from a serious analysis of music in Austen's novels to a serious analysis of which of the priests in her books is the hottest. Serious analyses only on Spinster's library. My channel isn't even specifically dedicated to Jane Austen, and yet she pops up all over the place. There are, however, YouTube channels that only make videos about Jane Austen. And if visual media is not your thing, there's a plethora of blogs and podcasts dedicated to discussing her work. I was a guest on one such podcast earlier this year. But the fandom expands beyond online media. There's a whole section of the publishing industry dedicated to selling books about Jane Austen. I don't mean Jane Austen's books, or even biographies of Jane Austen, but books about seemingly random hobby and lifestyle subjects that the author ties to Jane Austen in one way or another. Sew like Jane Austen, cook like Jane Austen, be more Jane. At this point, the gendered nature of this fandom has become glaringly obvious, right? These are books marketed to women, linking Jane Austen to traditionally feminine hobbies such as embroidery or gardening or interior decorating. But what about Jane Austen's books themselves? If you're getting into Jane Austen, that's where you'd naturally start. How are they marketed? If you're familiar with my channel, you know I love nothing more than judging a book by its cover. So let's look at some modern cover design choices made for Jane Austen's novel Persuasion, just as an example. These are all current ones found on the websites of various publishing houses. No trashy vintage covers in this video, I'm afraid. Penguin has several different editions on offer, clearly designed to appeal to different readers, from the traditional to the blandly decorative to the modern to the frankly weird. My favorite out of these, to no one's surprise, is the frankly weird. HarperCollins also has traditional or modern on offer, whereas budget publishing house Wordsworth, who have recently sworn off their infamous trashy book cover choices, is going with a twee and disappointingly inoffensive design. So, if you're a man with the urge to read Jane Austen, but also an aversion to, I don't know, pink love hearts and little bows, or whatever men are allergic to these days, you clearly have plenty of choice. And yet, very few men do make that choice. I'll admit that reliable statistics about the demographics of Jane Austen's readership are a bit thinner on the ground. The closest I could find was a survey run by the Jane Austen Society of North America in 2008, which determined that 96% of the 4,501 Janeites who responded were female. Perhaps this number has changed in the past 16 years, but the trend surely remains. Reading Jane Austen is an overwhelmingly female pastime. Why is that? I don't know. I'm in the worst possible position to answer that question. All I can do is see what men on the internet have said about why they do or don't read Jane Austen. I came across this thread on the Goodreads forum from about 10 years ago that discusses this question. Bear in mind that these are all people who love books enough to not just have a Goodreads account, but also participate in forum discussions. Alex starts off with a bold statement.
Anyone who likes literature likes Jane Austen. I'm blessed with a penis, for what it's worth.
I'm sure it's worth a lot, Alex. Nick writes,
I read Pride and Prejudice about 25 years ago, and at that time there didn't seem to be much of a perception of the novel as being primarily for women, any more than there was that Dickens, for example, was more for men. The whole idea that it had a mainly female-dominated readership seemed to emerge, in the UK at any rate, after the Colin Firth as Mr. Darcy thing in the BBC TV adaptation.
That's a really interesting theory and one we'll explore later in this video. While this is a fascinating glimpse into internet culture from the message board era, it doesn't tell us a whole lot about what men who read Jane Austen enjoy about reading Jane Austen. Luckily, there's more on the internet than decade-old message boards. There's podcasts too. Podcasts about Jane Austen, of course, but more interestingly for the purpose of this video, podcasts about masculinity. One such example is the Art of Manliness podcast, which in February of 2023 published their episode 871 with the title Jane Austen for Dudes. Have you ever noticed in the skincare section of the drugstore how moisturizers or face washes or sheet masks come in two flavors, normal and for men? The assumption being, I suppose, that women are the only humans with faces, or the default humans with faces, I should say. Really, the assumption is that a hydrating face lotion as a product is so inherently feminine that you don't have to put for women on the packaging because it's implied. And the only way to sell a hydrating face lotion to men is to make the whole packaging blue and slap the words "for men" on it. The Art of Manliness named this episode Jane Austen for Dudes, presumably from the same urge to clarify that Austen is, by default, for women, but in this case, because they added that little tagline, it's okay for men to indulge. This podcast is hosted by the founder of the Art of Manliness website, a mustachioed Mormon by the name of Brett McKay, who runs this business with his wife Kate. They publish articles such as What to Wear on Your First Date, The Decline of Male Space, and How to Make a Knife from an Old Saw Blade. I promise you I did not seek these articles out specifically, I simply clicked on the random article button at the top of the website. Brett's interest in Jane Austen is not a new development. All the way back in 2016, he wrote an article with the title Why Every Man Should Read Jane Austen. The cover picture for this is, weirdly enough, of Mr. Palmer, a really very minor character in Sense and Sensibility. The explanation for this is right in the first paragraph of the article.
Back in my law school days, I was taking a break from studying one Saturday to do some mindless TV watching. As I was flipping through the channels, I came across Hugh Laurie of Dr. House fame, all decked out in 19th century English gentleman garb. Because I was a House fan, I was curious what Hugh Laurie sounded like with his native British accent, so paused my channel surfing to find out. Then I looked down at the info ticker the cable box displays on the screen and saw that I was watching Sense and Sensibility. Ugh, Jane Austen? No way I would enjoy that.
But, surprise, surprise, he did enjoy it. Of course he did, because this particular adaptation of Sense and Sensibility from 1995 is an absolute masterpiece. So that's one man converted to the cause of the Janeites by the power of Hugh Laurie. The way Brett tries to convince other men to read Jane Austen is fascinating, because he doesn't say, read her books because they're incredible stories. He doesn't talk about the plot or the characters or the writing style. The entire article is about lessons, things you can learn from her books.
Austen will help you develop your theory of mind. When it comes to building the muscle of our theory of mind, Jane Austen's novels are akin to heavily plated barbells. Austen's stories teach important life lessons.
What life lessons, you might ask? Well, lessons such as
know thyself and humbly seek personal growth.
Just like Mr. Darcy does in Pride and Personal Growth.
Get outside of your own head and try to see yourself how others might see you, theory of mind, so you can triangulate a more accurate idea of who you really are, what's truly driving your behaviour, and the kind of consequences those actions have.
I don't know about you, but this sounds exhausting. This life advice-based approach is, I'm afraid, not unique to Brett McKay and the Art of Manliness. If you have a look at more of these types of articles, ones that are written by men with the aim of convincing other men to read Jane Austen, you'll notice a bit of a pattern. Man has preconceptions about Jane Austen's work. Man is confronted with Jane Austen's work, usually by wife or Hugh Laurie. Man is hooked on Jane Austen's work. Then man spends an entire article trying to justify his enjoyment of it by turning Austen's novels into self-help books. Sorry, I meant personal development books. Self-help books are, of course, for the ladies. In 2023, Andrew Miller wrote an article on the website of the Philadelphia Church of God with the title, Why Men Should Read Jane Austen. It actually references Brett McKay's earlier article and mentions it as the reason why the author got interested in Austen in the first place.
No man can accuse Brett McKay of femininity.
I wouldn't dare.
Reading her work can help navigate the unspoken complexities of interpersonal relationships, especially those relationships involving the opposite sex.
Here we go again with the life lessons.
For this reason, I believe every man should read Austen. In fact, I believe that reading Austen may be more beneficial to men than women. Women are biologically hardwired to be more social than men, and that fact means women generally do better on theory of mind tasks than men.
Wait, what?
So women probably do not have to read fiction to develop their theory of mind. Austen is mainly entertainment for them, but for men, Austen's works can be vital instruction on how to make educated guesses about real people.
Andrew, darling, you are allowed to enjoy these stories as stories. Jane Austen wrote Emma for you to have a good laugh. She wrote Persuasion for you to have a good cry. You don't need the excuse. You're not an alien on a mission to infiltrate Regency society. You're allowed a little bit of entertainment as a treat for being such a manly man. We see this life advice-based approach again and again and again.
As 21st century guys, we can learn a lot from the attitudes and behaviours displayed in Jane Austen's novels. While it would be possible to argue that Austen uses her novels to construct attributes of an ideal man, and this may be a very valid point, I believe the qualities that these men possess are worth striving for in our lives.
I think reducing Austen down to life lessons is doing her an injustice. Where are the articles about how her characters are incredible, or how her plots are gripping, or how her style and dialogue is witty and sparkling? Why are these men not talking about the universal appeal of these novels? they're not talking about these books as stories at all. They're not telling you to read Pride and Prejudice because Pride and Prejudice is as close to perfection as a novel can get. No, they're telling you to read Pride and Prejudice because by doing so you might learn something. For his podcast on Jane Austen for Dudes, Brett McKay managed to book a dude whose name might be familiar to some of you Janeites watching this. The guest on this episode is none other than John Mullen, whom you might know from his best-selling pop literary analysis book, What Matters in Jane Austen. Brett starts the podcast off by asking John Mullen about his own journey to Austen. And he, just like every other man we've heard from so far, starts off by saying how he didn't think he'd be into her at first because he didn't think that her books were for him.
I think I thought two things. I thought, well, these are rather, substanceless stories. They're just stories about genteel young women trying to find a husband. How important is that? The implied answer being not very important. Because I was 16 or 17 and I liked stories about people, hunting whales or going up the Congo River or, committing suicide at the end of the play or, real stuff.
Right.
Hamlet, Heart of Darkness, Moby Dick, that stuff.
To Brett McKay's credit, he does go on to ask Mullen about Jane Austen's life and her writing. In particular, the stylistic idiosyncrasies which make her such a groundbreaking novelist in her time. Mullen is an excellent interviewee. You can tell he approaches her writing from a deeply theoretical and academic perspective, but he still manages to communicate his ideas effectively to a more casual reader like myself. So he explains how free indirect speech works, gives some examples of Austen's unique writing style, goes into detail about one particular plot point in Emma, and is generally having a great time, bringing the joy of Austen's work to an audience he knows might not be all that familiar with it.
And she sees Mr. Elton coming down the lane. She pretends to break her lace in her boot. Oh, my lace is broken. And Mr. Elton invites them in the house. And Emma leaves Mr. Elton and Harriet alone together in the sitting room. Very difficult in the Jane Austen world in these novels for a man and a woman to be alone together. And Emma's off with the housekeeper, talking very loudly so that Mr. Elton can hear she's down, not in the room, she's not coming, about the lace. And sorry you have such a long description, but in Jane Austen novels, there's always so much going on.
I adore him on this podcast, I have to say, because Brett McKay tries so hard to steer the conversation towards the life lessons and theory of mind stuff and what men can learn from Austen. And John Mullen is trying so hard to meet him on that level. But unlike Brett, he clearly values the novels as more than just how-to-empathy manuals.
And the other thing about Austen that makes her fun to read, because as you're just doing that setup for Emma, there's a lot of, well, he was thinking this and she was thinking that, and actually he was actually thinking this. It's a workout for your social mind.
Totally.
And one thing I've read is that reading Austen can help you develop what psychologists call a theory of mind.
The theory of mind you mentioned, I think the fascinating thing with Jane Austen is that it works in a sort of double way. On the one hand, you look at the characters saying and doing things, and you see their consciousness of each other. So she's a wonderful, wonderful writer of dialogue. And the thing about Jane Austen novels is that when people say things to other people, everything they say and do is shaped by their assumptions about what the other person is thinking, which is the way life is, but it's not the way that all dialogue in novels is. Not many novelists can do it as well as her. But also there's this second sort of theory of mind aspect, which is the one in a way we've just been talking about, that as a reader, you have to she's not going to do it all for you. You have to work it out.
Then we get to the gender stuff.
So I imagine there's a lot of men listening to this podcast that might have written off Jane Austen as, a sentimental writer that's geared primarily towards a female audience. But what's interesting is I've been surprised to learn as if you go back in history, it's men who often turned to Austen during times of war and adversity. So I know during World War I, a lot of the British soldiers, they read Austen when they were in the trenches. And I know during World War II, Winston Churchill, like during the Blitz, he was reading Jane Austen. So I mean, what is it about Austen's writing that caused these men to turn to her during times of war?
Okay, well, I mean, that's a really interesting question, because there's a really good, your listeners might want to kind of chase it down. There's a really good Kipling short story called The Janeites. He invented the word Janeite, I think, which is exactly about, it's set after the First World War, but it's about men meeting up again because they were united in the trenches by exactly what you've just said, their enthusiasm for Jane Austen. Jane Austen's world must seem a blessed relief. You know, it is this elegantly circumscribed world of, you know, as she said, 3 or 4 families in a village. So, you know, nobody's going to get shot in a Jane Austen novel. But I think very often people just focus on that and assume that means the pleasure for some of those male readers in difficult situations or dangerous situations was one of escapism. And I just think, you know, judging from accounts people give as well as from her novels, that's not true, because within these worlds, lots of the people, lots of the characters are behaving in the most monstrous and selfish and absurd ways. You know, her novels, here's a pitch for them, they're terribly, terribly funny.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And you can enter them and become absorbed and find them really, really funny, evidently, from what people said, as the shells are going overhead.
Once again, McKay goes for the "what did soldiers get out of reading Austen" approach, and Mullen answers with, "they read them because they're really good books." It goes on like this, and I honestly don't know who to feel more sorry for. Brett for trying to rope John into a discussion about whether Austen represents Aristotelian principles, or John when he clearly doesn't have a clue what Brett is on about. Brett goes on about how we can learn to make ethical choices from Austen's characters. And John says that actually, because of Austen's innovative way of writing characters, we can't really take any moral guidance from them. It's absolutely glorious to see two men not so much engage in a topic, but kind of talk past each other for a solid hour. So far, I've pretty much only spoken about how men don't read Jane Austen, and if they do, they read her for what I think of as the wrong reasons. And sure, I'm glad that Brett and his fellow conservative Americans are getting some advice out of Sense and Sensibility, but surely there must be some men out there who like her books because they're brilliant novels, right? Right, of course they're out there. So I found some of them, which was harder than you might imagine, and asked them about it. How did you get into Jane Austen?
For a long time, I was a complete jerk about Jane Austen and refused to read anything that she had written. And I used to teach at high school, and a high school English teacher kind of challenged me to read Pride and Prejudice and, you know, actually see what I thought, you know, rather than just being a jerk and talking about something I didn't know anything about, which is, you know, a problem. But that's kind of how I got started.
I think from Jane Austen July, because I've been watching BookTube for like 5 years, but I used to read along to all the events, and I think just so many BookTubers that I liked were reading Jane Austen, and it's such a big event on BookTube.
And what's your favourite Jane Austen book?
Persuasion. Persuasion to me is the best love story between mature characters who've made mistakes and know what their mistakes are and still fall in love and are willing to take the risk of having that relationship.
Whenever I ask other people this, I say, what's your favourite Jane Austen book apart from Pride and Prejudice? Because I just think it is Pride and Prejudice. It's the perfect book.
What do you enjoy about her work? What appeals to you about it?
One of the reasons it took me so long to read her, and one of the reasons why I now love her so much, is I didn't realise that she was really funny. Her books are genuinely laugh out loud funny. What
I like most is just the way that she reveals things about characters, oftentimes in just a few lines with a look or, a brief description, or in conversation between them, or the way somebody else says something about them. you really, I think, learn a lot about her characters that's subtle and nuanced and makes them feel like more real people just because of her skill at kind of writing those characters and introducing them to you. I think that's kind of a really amazing thing. And not a lot of writers today or since then, I think, can pull it off.
She's amazing at structure as well. Like, I think she must have had a sort of an innate gift for it. Jane Austen is perfectly structured romances. So the resolution comes just at the right time, I think. It's pretty rare, especially I think modern writers are terrible at structure.
Why do you think you're in the minority as a man who reads Jane Austen?
Men are socialized, in the United States at least, to look askance at books written by women, to think that books by women didn't speak to me, that books by women were all about romance. And certainly, you know, Jane Austen's novels all revolve around love and marriage, but there's so much more there than just those things. I have experience, because I'm married, of living with a woman and being in a relationship. And like I said, it doesn't mean I know everything about women, but it means I have some experience in those relationships. So the relationships she described speak to me as they do to everybody. And I don't think it has anything to do with gender. And so I think a lot of men are just convinced that it does, and convinced that it's all just romance, and they don't want to read romance, which is also silly, by the way. I
can only think of it as like the reasons why I didn't read Jane Austen or anything like Jane Austen. And it's because when I think of like Regency, or when I thought of Regency, I thought of like clothes and people having serious conversations walking around a park. Like, I thought of the adaptations basically, and they always sort of seemed like dry and stuffy to me. It was more ignorance, I think, than anything else, because they're not dry and stuffy. Like, I love I love adaptations now as well. I think maybe other men might kind of be embarrassed, maybe think, oh, I don't want to be known for reading that, but I have no shame.
Is there something inherently feminine about Jane Austen's work? Do her books naturally appeal to women more, or do you think it's an effect of something else, like marketing or modern culture?
I think it's definitely marketing, and all the romances in these books are between a man and a woman. It's a 50-50 thing. It doesn't make any sense that it's more for women. And romance is just a bigger part of people's lives. It doesn't matter what your gender is. There's
something inherently feminine about the perspective of the novel, that, you know, you are more often in the head of the female characters and seeing things through their eyes, and the way relationships worked, and the way the, you know, economy of marriage worked in Victorian England. You see that through the woman's eyes and not through the male character's eyes, really. So I do think that's inherently a feminine point of view, but I think the idea that should be a bar to men reading it or understanding it is silly.
Have you had any comments about being a man who reads Jane Austen, either online or offline, and have they been positive or negative?
You know, I think that there may have been a couple of negative comments about just about Jane Austen in general, and that were left on my videos that, you know, it wasn't that they were accusing me necessarily of not being manly enough, but of intentionally reading books by women to gain the approval of women.
Someone at my work the other day did say to me, oh, you read a lot of women authors, which is unusual. A lot of my favourite authors are women, and I think that might be slightly unusual, comment worthy, but I don't know anyone else who reads Jane Austen in real life apart from my workmates, and they're all women, so they don't really care.
If you enjoyed these two and the way they talk about books, by the way, do subscribe to their bookish YouTube channels, which you'll find linked down below. Honestly, after Brett and his personal development approach, it's a breath of fresh air to hear men talk about Austen's novels as novels. Once again though, these are male readers who had to be convinced to read Austen. It wasn't presented to them as a natural and obvious choice of book. Why does it take a wife or a mother or Hugh Laurie to get men interested? Why is there a hurdle to be overcome in the first place?
As I get older, I realise that thrillers and action-paced books don't interest me anymore. That is why I seem to like Jane Austen novels. However, is it really okay for men to read what is potentially a female type of book?
A lot of it comes down to the perception of Jane Austen's novels as romances, and this perception doesn't come out of nowhere. Romantic relationships are not just featured in Austen's works, they are arguably central to them. There's not a single Austen novel that doesn't, to a lesser or greater extent, revolve around the concept of marriage. Although even within her books there are nuances. The marriage plot in Mansfield Park, for example, is about as romantic as a trip to the dentist. Disagree? Tell me about it in the comments. It's not like I can stop Mansfield Park fans. They're a force of nature. It would be foolish for me to argue that Austen's books are not romantic. However, and that's the big distinction, they're not romances. A romance, in the modern literary sense, not the 18th century literary sense, is a story in which the main plot and the development of a romantic relationship are one and the same. Austen's novels are not that, with the exception perhaps of Persuasion. There have been articles written about this question. There have been Reddit threads. There have been videos made.
Are Jane Austen's novels love stories?
This topic is an interesting and nuanced one. But for the purposes of this video, it doesn't actually matter whether Pride and Prejudice is a romance or a societal satire or a comedy of manners. What's much more important than the question of whether Jane Austen's novels are romances is the fact that they are perceived as romances by the people who haven't read them. We can blame this perception on the publishing industry or high school curricula or Colin Firth, but the effect is still the same. Men assume that Jane Austen wrote romances, which they find off-putting. There's a whole other video to be made about the gendered nature of romance fiction and why it's not going to kill a man to get in touch with romantic sentiments, fictional or otherwise. But that's a topic for another time and another video and very much another YouTuber. It's undeniable that the connotation of Austen with romance literature is part of the reason why it's so unpopular with men, at least with men who haven't read her books. There's a fascinating paper with the title Men Reading Jane Austen, Close Writing Across Gender Scripts by Noah Fields of Brown University, who won the 2017 Global Undergraduate Prize for it. They explore the question, what exactly is subversive about men reading and moreover liking Jane Austen? Fields brings up Austen's particular writing style, what scholars have named free indirect discourse, free indirect dialogue, and close writing. It's the same thing mentioned by Brett McKay and John Mullen on the Art of Manliness podcast. It's Austen's stylistic method for permeating the entire story with a subjectivity that makes us experience the events of the books through the eyes of her characters. There's many videos and articles which explain this style in greater detail. It's one of the many ways in which Jane Austen has left a massive and unmissable mark on the way novels are written to this day. Noah Fields goes really into the gender theory of it, using Northanger Abbey as an example of subverting what they call a gender script. Catherine's declarative assumption sets a gendered script: women read novels, but gentlemen read better books. According to Catherine's script, men should not read novels because they are not manly. Consequently, Henry must dance his way out of being read by Catherine as effeminate, passive, weak, susceptible, for his reading habits in order to uphold his manhood and prove his suitability as a partner. If you're a man reading Jane Austen, you are, consciously or not, subverting expectations of what we as a society have deemed appropriate for you to consume in your spare time. If you're a fan of subverting expectations, excellent, well done. Continue to enjoy these books. If you're of a more conservative persuasion, I guess you tell yourself that you read them for life lessons on theory of mind and Aristotelian principles. Whatever it takes, my friend. Jane Austen's reputation as not just a women's writer, but a feminist writer is as undeniable as it is questionable. She has become more than an author of novels, to the point where if you are a man reading Jane Austen, you are making a statement. I mentioned Jane Austen's presence on the £10 note. That came about as a result of a social media campaign in the early 2010s, when it was noticed that after the replacement of Elizabeth Fry with Charles Dickens on the £5 note, the only woman featured on British currency would be Her Late Majesty the Queen. And so Jane Austen was chosen for the £10 note. Critics of that decision were up in arms, arguing that Jane Austen was only picked because she was a woman. Proponents of that decision argued that Jane Austen was picked because she was an author whose influence on modern literature is immense. Both are true. Jane Austen was chosen because she was a woman whose influence on modern literature is immense. It's still a shame that it took the effort of a social media campaign to get the Bank of England to put one lady on the back of a banknote. But if you're arguing that Jane Austen doesn't deserve that honour, you're delusional. The thing about Austen's novels, I say the thing as if there's a singular thing about Austen's novels, but you know what I mean, is that they are pretty much exclusively set in historically female spaces. Drawing rooms, ballrooms, the dinner table. Austen writes about her world as experienced by women. And as it happens, marriage was a pretty big deal for the women of her time, since they had practically no other opportunity for a self-actualized life that didn't depend on a man. But Austen's books are also about the relationships women form with other women, the sisterly bonds of the Dashwoods or the Bennets, or the relationships the heroines have with their female mentors like Anne Elliot and Lady Russell, and of course the relationships with mothers and aunts who feature in every single one of Austen's novels. I do think that's what sets Austen apart from most other female authors of the 19th century. This focus on women's spaces and women's relationships at the center of her stories. But surely it's insulting to the male capacity for empathy to suggest that a man lacks the understanding to read a book where he isn't the center of attention. Let's go back to Rudyard Kipling. I've teased his involvement in this topic for the entire video, so here he is, the headline act. His short story, The Janeites, published in 1924. The story is set at a Freemasons' lodge, which is currently being cleaned by some of its members or brethren. One of them, by the name of Humberstall, recounts his experiences in the First World War, where he served in France in the artillery. He talks about his fellow soldiers and about the secret society of the Janeites, which he joins entirely by accident.
They begin, as often as not, on this secret society woman I was telling you of, this Jane. She was the only woman I ever heard him say a good word for.
Humberstall is curious about this Jane and the way the other soldiers spoke about her, not as a historical figure, but as a real woman that he thought they might know in person. The other soldiers, all of differing ranks both in the military and socially, all bond over this shared enjoyment of Austen. Humberstall first joins the secret society because of this sense of community. The parallels drawn here between the secret society of the Janeites and the Freemasons is pretty obvious. Sooner or later though, Humberstall really gets into the books. Though at first, he can't quite explain the hype.
Oh, Jane was real then? Anthony glanced for an instant at me as he put the question. I couldn't quite make that out. Real! Humberstall's voice rose almost to a treble. Jane? Why, she was a little old maid who'd written half a dozen books about 100 years ago. 'Twasn't as if there was anything to 'em either. I know, I had to read 'em. They weren't adventurous, nor smutty, nor what you'd call even interesting. All about girls of 17, they begun young then, I tell you. Not certain whom they'd like to marry, and their dances and card parties and picnics and their young blokes going off to London on horseback for haircuts and shaves.
And yet, despite the banality of Jane Austen's works, according to Humberstall, there's clearly something about her books that speaks to him. Specifically, he finds her characters relatable.
I mean that her characters was no use. They was only just like people you run across any day. One of them was a curate, the Reverend Collins, always on the make and looking to marry money. Well, when I was a Boy Scout, him or his twin brother was our troop leader. And, oh yes, there was Miss Bates, just an old maid running around like an hen with her head cut off and her tongue loose at both ends. I've got an aunt like her, good as gold, but you know.
The soldiers connect with Jane Austen's work so much that they start naming their weapons after her characters, which gets Humberstall in trouble when he tries naming one of the cannons after Lady Catherine de Bourgh, but doesn't get the spelling quite right and ends up writing bug on it instead. But because it's a World War I story, it's not all fun and games and accidentally writing rude words on heavy artillery.
Not so many of them left to run after now. With the heavies, it's mostly neck or nothing. We copped it in the neck in due time. Well, you come out of it all right. Anthony spoke both stoutly and soothingly, but Humberstall would not be comforted. That's right, but I almost wish I hadn't, he sighed.
Humberstall is the only one of the Janeites to survive the war. This story has been interpreted in many different ways since its release. Some readers take it as a historical account of soldiers reading Jane Austen for comfort in the war. This has since been debunked, and I'll link you to an interesting article about it by Bill Bell. While there is the occasional mention of Jane Austen in letters written by World War I soldiers, there is no evidence at all about a cult or even a trend or a fashion or any larger scale reading of Jane Austen in the trenches. But that's not really the point of Kipling's story. The works of Jane Austen, the everydayness of her writing, as Kipling understands them, is juxtaposed with the brutalities of war. These fictional soldiers cling to her books because they remind them of home, of their parents, families and neighbors and friends, and of life going on in a way they're missing out on. Some readers interpret this story as pure satire, as Kipling saying, ha ha, look at soldiers clinging to the most trite literature in order to forget the cruelty of war. But I don't think it's that either. He's not calling Austen's work shallow or trite or banal. Instead, I think he's praising the characterization for being so close to life. Ex-soldier Humberstall is entirely flabbergasted by how much he cares about the characters in these stories. He can't explain it to himself. Is it just the contrast between the comparatively carefree lives the people lead in Austen's works and his own traumatizing experiences in the war? Or is it because of the way the characters are written in such a close-to-life way that makes them so relatable to him? Either way, Kipling does in no way suggest, like Brett McKay of the Art of Manliness podcast does, that the value of Austen's works lies in some sort of life lessons the soldiers might have taken away from it. Instead, it's all about the stories themselves, the way they don't just entertain, but stick with the reader. I try to be patient with men, I really do, but every time I see a dismissal of Jane Austen's work by someone who hasn't given them a good go, I can't take them seriously. If you've made it this far into the video, I'm probably preaching to the choir, but I promise you, you're not risking your masculinity by giving Jane Austen's works a try. If you're a man who otherwise enjoys classic literature, or even enjoys books in general, you're missing out on some absolutely essential reading here. My audience is overwhelmingly female millennials, so I'm under no illusion that this video is going to make the tiniest bit of difference. But if you are one of the 23% of men watching this video, do give Austen a go. And if you're a man who reads and enjoys her books, then talk to the people around you about them. I honestly feel like this video could have gone on for another hour or two. You're probably glad it didn't. And if you're still watching at this point in the video, I commend you. It's a real shame that more men aren't reading Jane Austen, because it's obvious that those who do get a lot out of it, whether that's life lessons or simply enjoyment of some fantastic literature. Unfortunately, Jane Austen does not have the luxury of standing on her own merit. Her name is inextricably linked with the idea of feminine literature, which makes reading her work an unnecessarily radical act for men.
I started getting interested in Jane Austen in my teenage years. One day my father saw me reading Emma and told me why I was reading a book for bored housewives. This made me feel ashamed of my desire to read Austen, and I only read the books or watched the adaptations in private. I basically never talk about this part of my life to others until recently.
Isn't that kind of sad that men need to overcome all this nonsense in order to enjoy things that are good for them, whether that's literature or skincare? Gents, do me a favor too, actually. Moisturize your face and read Jane Austen, because you're worth it. Thank you for watching. Bye. You have 30 seconds to convince the average man on the street to read Jane Austen. Go.
Wow. Okay. You should read Jane Austen because they're books about really attractive women who are really interesting and lead really interesting lives, and they meet up with really interesting men and live happily ever after. That's about the best I can do.
You should read the Jane Austen book because they're really funny, and there's not many funny books in the world. What else can I say? They're not all about clothes. They're perfectly structured. The bad characters are hilarious and you love to hate them. There's lots of quite chivalrous men in them, but there's lots of evil men as well. And there's lots of sort of strong, interesting women. So if your interest is only in women, there's great women characters.
An enormous thank you to the two men who've let me interview them for this video. That's Aaron from Aaron Read a Book and Brian from Bookish. You'll find their channels linked in the description box, of course. Please do check them both out. And another massive thank you to Bill for the voiceover. He also has a YouTube channel, though it's not about books, but instead about retro video games. If you're interested in that, you can find him at The Retro Sofa, also linked in the description box.
I'm a dude!